From St. Louis Public Radio. This is the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. I'm Jason Rosenbaum. Later in the hour, we'll talk with Republican State Senator Ben Brown about Governor Mike Kehoe's plan to phase out the state's income tax. And we'll also talk with GOP House Majority Leader Alex Riley about his view of the 2026 session and his plans when he becomes Speaker of the House in 2027. But first, let's not mince words here. President Donald Trump has spent the first 3 weeks of 2026 shattering America's foreign policy. That includes a shock invasion of Venezuela that resulted in the capture of the country's president, Nicolas Maduro. And over the holiday weekend, Trump made belligerent demands to take over Greenland, a territory that's belonged to Denmark for centuries. Trump later backed down on placing sanctions on European countries over Greenland after conducting a marathon speech at the World Economic Forum in Switzerland, where he happened to insult some of America's traditional allies like Canada, the United Kingdom, and France. And in some respects, the Greenland crisis threatens to blow up a global order that a Missourian helped create. President Harry S. Truman kickstarted NATO after the end of World War II and also helped rebuild Europe through the Marshall Plan. But Missouri's junior senator, Eric Schmitt, seemed to be perfectly fine with upending that aforementioned world order during an interview earlier this week on Fox News.
They have civilizational crisis in Europe. The United States doesn't intend to follow them down that road. But you're right. You can't overstate the strategic importance for the United States of America and the NATO alliance, quite frankly, of the United States, acquiring Greenland, whether it's ballistic missile defense, whether it's what's happening in space, whether it's the Arctic sea lanes that might open up. There's a lot of reasons that the United States has a very important interest in making sure that Greenland is protected.
Schmitt's comments may be an outlier, even among the Senate GOP caucus. Missouri Senator Josh Hawley, for instance, told this to Cape Girardeau-based KFVS on January 14th, before some of Trump's recent remarks both at the World Economic Forum in Switzerland and elsewhere.
We do have a very significant military installation in Greenland. We do have long-standing agreements with Denmark and Greenland related to their security and also, most importantly, to ours. So I think that's a good foundation to build from. I'm not aware of other needs to acquire the entire space or to occupy it in any way. I would say we certainly want to maintain our military base there, and if we need to upgrade our military base or it needs to be more significant, we want to be able to deploy anti-ballistic missile shields over it, for example. That all makes total sense to me. I'd hope we could do that within our existing treaty framework.
With both Hawley and Schmitt often linked to higher national office, their views on the latest foreign policy decisions that Trump is making could attract more scrutiny beyond Missouri's borders. Joining us now is Stephen Smith, the Kate M. Gregg Emeritus Professor of Social Science at Washington University. He's also a professor at Arizona State University. Professor Smith, welcome to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air.
Great to be with you.
You just heard clips from Senators Eric Schmitt and Josh Hawley on the prospect of taking over Greenland. What do you see as the key differences between the two GOP senators based on what you heard?
Well, most of what I know about the two over the last couple of years since Eric Schmidt's been in the Senate is that they're pretty similar. They're both advocates of the America First stance that the president has taken, but they have differed here recently on the saber rattling that we're seeing from the Trump White House. Senator Schmitt is all in with Trump. He has not differed from Trump in any significant way since he's been in the Senate and on the Senate Armed Services Committee, really on any national security or foreign policy matter. Senator Hawley's generally on board with the America First theme of the Trump foreign policy, but he has differed significantly on the issues of Venezuela and Greenland, at least so far. On Venezuela, of course, he was among 5 Senate Republicans to vote against the president's position on the Senate taking up a war powers resolution related to Venezuela. In that case, the resolution would have demanded that Congress support any additional military action in Venezuela. The resolution was bottled up in committee, and those 5 Republicans, along with the Democrats, voted to discharge the committee. Well, that led to a lot of criticism from the White House and a great deal of pressure being put on those 5 Republicans to change their minds about the matter. And Senator Hawley did. So when there was a procedural question that came up that really mattered, because if it was decided in the favor of the president's position, it would really prevent further Senate action. And that's what happened. He changed his mind, as did Senator Young, creating a tie vote and allowing the vice president to break the tie. So further Senate action on that resolution was at least temporarily stalled.
Right, and I actually want to ask you about that, because I spoke with Senator Hawley right after he announced he was going to abandon support for Virginia Senator Tim Kaine's war powers resolution on Venezuela, and he told me he decided not to support it anymore because he got assurances from Secretary of State Marco Rubio that there wouldn't be any ground troops there. But given what we've heard over the last week, where Trump has made all these remarks about taking over Greenland, is it fair to say that Rubio's assurances may not be as ironclad as they were like a couple of weeks ago?
Well, of course, the assurances were with respect to Venezuela. And Greenland now is a different situation, where the president certainly has taken a stronger position than he has vis-a-vis Venezuela. He wants the U.S. to own Greenland, and he's never made that claim for Venezuela. He wants the United States to run Venezuela but own Greenland. And there, it appears that Senator Hawley has made the clear argument that we already have the military installations and the capacity to expand them without further steps, except for negotiations with Denmark. And Denmark, of course, has indicated its willingness to conduct such discussions. So there's clearly a big difference between Hawley and Schmitt. Schmitt clearly is backing up the president on virtually everything here, and Hawley's willing to distance himself a bit.
So Schmitt in particular has been particularly loud in his support of pretty much everything Trump has said over the last week.
Right.
His Twitter and Facebook feeds include long rationalizations on why Greenland should be part of the United States. And he's even said this on his Facebook page, quote, "The same people who are pearl clutching about, quote, undermining the NATO alliance are the same people who never demand European NATO countries step up in a more meaningful way for the defense of their own continent." Now, look, I think there's some legitimate criticism of how European countries contributed less to Ukraine after Russia's invasion. Like Germany is a glaring example of that, given that they were so subservient to Russia when it comes to natural gas. But that sort of Facebook statement from Schmitt seems really unprecedented in terms of rhetoric. We really don't hear a lot of United States lawmakers talk about how NATO is like basically a bunch of deadbeat countries. Or is this kind of like new territory for the Republican Party to be openly chastising NATO like this?
Well, to say the least. And in the case of Senator Schmitt, he's rewording the same rhetoric that we're hearing from President Trump. So to take an extreme position with respect to U.S. relations with NATO is something that he's simply mimicking Trump on. Hawley takes a somewhat different approach. He will. He's not Trump first and foremost. He does have a little bit more background and I think, works to be a little bit more thoughtful about his stances on national security affairs than Senator Schmitt, at least as we've seen from Schmitt so far.
Yeah, and I have followed Senator Hawley's foreign policy rhetoric for a while, and he is firmly in the Eldridge Colby camp, who is a defense, who works for the Department of Defense, and has been very vocal about the idea that we should, as a country, focus our energy on combating China instead of Europe, which we could have an argument one way or another whether that's a good idea, but that's a coherent thesis. I'm not denying that that's not debatable. I think what's interesting, though, is what Trump is doing on Greenland now seems to be completely counterproductive to that. I'm going to play a clip now from Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, who made this frankly stunning statement at the World Economic Forum in Switzerland.
Over the past 2 decades, a series of crises in finance, health, energy, and geopolitics have laid bare the risks of extreme global integration. But more recently, great powers have begun using economic integration as weapons. Tariffs as leverage, financial infrastructure as coercion, supply chains as vulnerabilities to be exploited. You cannot live within the lie of mutual benefit through integration when integration becomes the source of your subordination.
That was Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney earlier this week at the World Economic Forum in Switzerland. Now, I want to provide a caveat here. There has always been kind of an anti-American edge to Canadian foreign policy statements. Like Justin Trudeau made those types of comments, and even some conservative prime ministers have been doing foreign policy that are different from what American foreign policy does. But I think from my biggest takeaway from that is Canada doesn't see the United States as an honest arbiter or a reliable partner anymore, which is why they are moving closer to China. So my question is, do you think comments like from what you heard from Carney actually go against Hawley and to some extent Schmitt's desire to contain China, given that Canada may end up being closer to China when this is all said and done?
The short answer is yes. The longer answer is that the America First doctrine that the president actually put in place by executive order on his very first day in office back in January 2025 is one of kind of an extreme form of American self-interest. The Republicans and Trump advocated minimizing foreign entanglements of various kinds. This is in the aftermath of a couple of decades of fighting in South Asia. They focus on a very transactional economic foreign policy, one that gives up on traditional American efforts to promote democracy, to address humanitarian crises, and building soft power through educational, cultural, and development efforts. So it's a more self-interested, it's a more short-term perspective. Now, the need to address China, and of course, as you say, Senator Hawley has given China the greatest emphasis as the most serious threat to American interests in the world today and over the next few decades. The question is whether the United States can do that on its own. Don't we need the cooperation of the rest of the world, and especially of Europe, which of course is the other major Western economic market, to be able to combat China and its influence in other parts of the world effectively? It would be and it will be very hard for China, for the United States to address China on its own. As you have indicated, the Canadians have started negotiations and come to some agreements already. Separately with China, we know that other parts of the world, especially big economic powers like Mexico and Brazil, have been moving in that direction too and have already taken important steps. So it is an open question about how the United States and Republicans who are supporting the Trump administration can balance their America First emphasis of going it alone, with really the need to coordinate efforts to effectively combat China. While the Chinese situation is largely an economic one so far, because Taiwan's involved, it's potentially a military one.
Right.
Of course, we needed that world coalition to fight the Soviet Union, largely on military grounds, and that may end up being the case with China too.
I mentioned on the outset that I think it's important to pay attention to Hawley and Schmitt because they could become prominent executive branch players eventually. Hawley is linked to running for president perhaps in 2028 or 2032. And I think one of the worst kept secrets in Missouri politics is Schmitt wants to be part of J.D. Vance's potential administration. They're pretty close friends. I don't know if he'd be vice president, but maybe some cabinet member if he ends up winning the election in 2028. How much do you think that both of these senators could influence the last few years of the Trump era, given the president's propensity for, let's just say, an erratic foreign policy agenda?
Well, there's certainly an important difference in style. Senator Schmitt has taken a fairly open Christian nationalist perspective on both domestic and foreign policy. It was only a few months ago when he made the statement at an important conference that was so organized by the so-called national conservatives, which is a bit of a twist on the Christian conservatism. At that conference, he was explicit that the United States is the product of Christian pilgrims pouring onto our shores from Europe, and indicating that America doesn't belong to the new immigrants; it belongs to us Christians. This is a very openly Christian national stance, and it seems to organize his thought about foreign policy and national security affairs. For Hawley, he's looking for more traditional arguments about how the United States can succeed in world affairs. And focusing on China shows that certainly is a place where economic and military competition is becoming more and more important and justifies a shift in priorities. So he defines the agenda somewhat differently. While he too caters to the right side of the Republican Party and Christian nationalists, his focus in the foreign and national security side is somewhat, in fact, much more nuanced than what we see from Senator Schmitt.
Steve Smith is the Kate M. Gregg Emeritus Professor of Social Science at Washington University. He's also a professor at Arizona State University. Professor, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
When we return, we'll talk with Missouri State Senator Ben Brown about Governor Mike Kehoe's plan to phase out Missouri's income tax. This is the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. Welcome back to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. I'm Jason Rosenbaum. Now that we're more than a week removed from Missouri Governor Mike Kehoe's State of the State speech, it's pretty clear that the biggest news that came out of that address was a plan to phase out the state's income tax. The proposal, which is contingent on voter approval, would end the income tax over a 5-year period and replace much of the lost revenue with an expanded sales tax on services. As Kehoe explained to St. Louis Public Radio last week, he sees the plan as a way to spur population growth.
The general revenue that we collect from Missouri income taxes is nearly $9 billion. And if you put $9 billion back into Missourians' pockets, I believe they'll spend the money and it will have a more positive effect than if government was spending that money.
But critics of the proposal say that getting rid of the income tax could either send the state into a fiscal calamity, are soak consumers with higher prices because of a bolstered sales tax. And Democratic House Minority Leader Ashley Awney of Kansas City said this month that's not a responsible approach given the state's budgetary problems.
He's already provided a preview of the hard times to come by proposing $600 million in core cuts in his proposed fiscal year 2027 state budget and underfunding K-12 public schools by at least $190 million. And if tax hike Mike gets his way, the financial crisis will get progressively worse.
One Republican lawmaker who has been at the forefront of the income tax issue for a long time is State Senator Ben Brown, who represents Franklin, Gasconade, Warren, and Osage counties, as well as part of West St. Louis County in the Missouri Senate. He joins us now to talk about the future of the state's income tax. Senator Brown, welcome to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air.
Hey, Jason. Great to be back on the show.
You have been on the, quote, Missouri shouldn't have an income tax train for a while. Why do you think the state would be better off without it?
I absolutely have. I think this is a real opportunity for us to establish ourselves as a real leader in our region and put us at a competitive advantage compared to those that, the states that we directly compete with, those that directly border us. Our population growth has been relatively stagnant for some time. And, you can look at data that really, it's a great indicator as to why that's the case. Last year, when I was carrying the Senate version of the income tax elimination bill, I really dug into the numbers. I was looking at growth trends. And so I have, based on 2024 numbers, you look at the top 5 states that are experiencing the most growth. 3 out of the top 5 have an income tax rate of 0%, and 4 of the top 7. And then, I'm kind of a little bit of an analytic nerd, so what I did is I took all the data and I put it on a spreadsheet, and I just narrowed it down to just Missouri and the 8 states that border us, just to see how we stack up compared to those we are in the most direct competition with. And what I found in Missouri, we're towards the bottom in terms of lowest income tax rate. At the 2024, it was 4.8%. That would put us in 6th place. The 5 states that are ahead of us in terms of a lower income tax rate are also the 5 states that happen to be ahead of us in terms of population growth. The 3 states that all have a higher income tax rate are also the 3 states that happen to be lagging behind us in terms of population growth or loss. So, while obviously income tax rate is not going to be the only determining factor when businesses are deciding where to move, but the data it's really undeniable that it is one of the most predominant factors.
If Missouri did get rid of its income tax, it would join Alaska, Washington State, Wyoming, New Hampshire, Florida, Texas, Tennessee, South Dakota, and Nevada. But several listeners pointed out that those states get their taxes in other ways. Jessica Rose wrote on TikTok, I lived in Texas, and the property taxes were 4 times higher than they are in Missouri. The government will get their taxes one way or another. Full disclosure, my sister lives in Texas, and she told me basically the same thing. So what would you say to the argument that getting rid of the income tax isn't really a cost saving for Missourians if taxes go up elsewhere?
Yeah, I would say that's a very static form of analysis when you really need to be looking at it in dynamic terms. That doesn't account for any population growth, any additional economic activity that will occur. I mean, you have to think about the fact that essentially just about every Missourian that has an income will see a 4.7% annual increase in the amount of income they have. That's 4.7% that all those individuals have that could be disposable income. That means more dining out at restaurants, more shopping. And every time you're out there, there's some kind of business transaction. That's bringing in additional tax revenue through sales tax. And then those businesses, as a small business owner myself, a lot of people I think don't realize just how many points through that process as money comes into the business and, works its way and is paid out to employees, paid out to vendors, all the points at which that money is taxed. So by spurring this additional economic activity, that's actually going to increase the revenue coming in. So it's important to keep in mind that as the volume of business transactions go up, and set aside even the growth we'd see due to any additional population and businesses that this attracts, the taxpayers are getting the raise. It translates to more disposable income, and as that number increases, that it will also bring the sales tax rate down, because there's a provision in this joint resolution that prohibits a windfall to the government. So if you're having more sales tax coming in, we can't have more revenue than the previous year. So they would have to adjust the sales tax rate down to balance that out.
So when I mentioned those other states, they all have something that draws a lot of revenue, maybe with the exception of like Wyoming, South Dakota, and New Hampshire. Though South Dakota and Wyoming are large tourist destinations. But Nevada has gambling. Texas and Alaska have oil and natural gas. Tennessee and Florida have a lot of tourist attractions. What do you think that Missouri has that's similar to those states that could bring in a lot of revenue if the income tax goes away?
Well, I mean, you do have a point that some do have tourism, states like Florida and Nevada, as you mentioned. And some have, people made the point that some have significant oil resources like Texas and Alaska. But keep in mind, there are also states like New Hampshire and South Dakota without either. Missouri, we do have some tourism. We are centrally located. There are a lot of transportation that occurs throughout our state. And I think that makes it an attractive place for people to move to. If we just remove those barriers, we are lagging behind all our neighbors, and I think that is the reason why our growth has been stagnant up to this point, despite the fact that Missouri does have a whole lot to offer.
Let's move to Kehoe's plan specifically. Kehoe wants to expand the state's sales taxes on services. He pointed specifically to digital subscriptions like Audible. I brought up Fortnite Battle Pass because I have a subscription to that, and I guess it would go from $11.99 to whatever the sales tax is, so $12.46 a month or whatever. But voters banned these taxes in 2016. Why do you think they're going to reverse this in 2026, especially if there's a lot of interest groups that do not want to be taxed that are going to spend a lot of money to defeat this plan?
Well, I think that, there will be an expansion to a certain extent. So you will see expansion on some services. But keep in mind, assuming the sales tax rate is around where it is right now, and this will be determined by the General Assembly. They will have to establish what these triggers are exactly, and that will be a determining factor in what the sales tax rate is. And then it will be balanced out with the volume of transactions that occur as well. So that will all play into the sales tax rate. But assuming it's around where it is now, or even if you assume that it went up to a certain extent, you're still getting a 4.7% raise in the amount of money that you're getting on that paycheck every week. So, think about, I've asked people this last year when I was discussing this, the version of the bill that came through last year. Like, what percentage of your paycheck do you think that you spend on services? And you get, maybe 10%, 15, 20% usually would be the answers I got. Okay, so if you have to pay an additional 4 or 5, say even 6% more on just, go with the higher answers I got, 20% of your purchases, you're still coming off way, way ahead in the long run. You're still receiving more money than the additional money that you're expending at that point. Mm-hmm. So to me, it's just really a no-brainer that you're going to benefit from this. And then with the added factor of, we're signaling to the rest of the country, and I think how the state markets this is an important thing too. We need to get the messaging out. Assuming this is passed by the voters, we need to get the messaging out to the rest of the country that this is the path that we're on. Missouri is open for business. Come here, join us, and just really demonstrate that Missouri is a great place to come live, raise a family, or start a business.
Kehoe has also said he does not want the sales tax expansion on services to include agriculture, healthcare, or real estate. I'm going to be honest with you, Senator. There's probably a lot of other industries that are going to lobby really hard if this passes to people like you to say, exempt us as well. If you exempt certain things from a services expansion, do you run the risk of losing so much revenue that you cannot even do basic governmental things like build roads, fund schools, protect children from abuse or neglect? I'm not talking about like broad economic incentives. I'm talking about just state government functioning if you exempt too many things.
Well, yeah, I think that's something that we do need to be cautious of, because that's also going to be a determining factor in where our overall sales tax rate ends up. For instance, if we broaden the sales tax base and we didn't have any exemptions at all, we could bring the sales tax rate potentially under 4%, so less than it is now. The governor has pointed out certain exemptions that he's going to be insistent on, such as medical services, real estate, etc. I believe in a recent interview, Speaker Patterson stated that he's going to ensure that there would be no new increased motor fuel taxes as well. There are some that do make sense, but if you open this up, you open Pandora's box, and you're giving out all these exemptions, that's going to lead to a higher sales tax rate, and that's something that we have to be very mindful of. So I think that there are a few things that have been pointed out by the governor, by the speaker, that I think you can make very good cases for. But other than that, I think that we need to be very disciplined and ensure that we're keeping that sales tax rate overall very low too.
In the last couple minutes we have left, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention a big procedural thing here, and that this has to go through the legislature to actually make it on the 2026 ballot. This past week, your Democratic colleagues have prevented gubernatorial appointments from passing. They have said they might filibuster as many things as possible in retaliation for what happened last year. Do you think you can even get this on the ballot and even have this discussion with voters in the last minute or so?
Well, I think the key thing is that we need to have communication. And I think in the Senate that is key. I have a good relationship with all my Democrat colleagues. I've worked with them on issues that nobody thought had a chance to make it through the legislature. But I think that by approaching them in a manner where I just address them and have an open, honest, and respectful conversation, I think almost all my colleagues are willing to listen when you approach it in that manner. So I think it's all about how these conversations transpire, making sure that both sides are included in the conversations. And I think it's when the communication gets shut down, I think that's when you see the breakdown and the resulting chaos or holding up of any kind of momentum that we're seeing right now.
Okay, you do have another minute, so I jumped the gun a little bit. Do you think this could actually pass? There's going to be a lot of people who are going to spend money against this. And, the realtors were the people that banned sales taxes on services to begin with. Do you think that if big interest groups spend millions of dollars to try to defeat this, it may not have a good chance of passing, especially in the environment we're in where GOP-leaning ideas may not be as popular because of national sort of things?
I think that if it's on the ballot, that it will pass. I think that this is good common sense legislation. This isn't just a plan someone came up with overnight. I've spent the last couple of years sitting in meetings, we're talking with some of the best experts on tax policy in the country, and the governor's team has as well. We've gone through all the real-world examples. We've looked at examples of states that have done this incorrectly, where they've gone wrong, states that have been the most successful, identified and isolated certain metrics, like what led to success in this state versus what caused a tax reduction program to fail in another. We have learned from those mistakes, and the plan put forward is a very methodical, it allows flexibility. It's very well thought out, and I think that the voters are going to see that and see the true benefit that it will provide.
State Senator Ben Brown represents Missouri's 26th senatorial district, which takes in Franklin, Osage, Gasconade, and Warren counties, as well as part of western St. Louis County. Senator, thank you again for joining us.
It's my pleasure, Jason. Anytime.
When we come back, we'll talk with House Majority Leader Alex Riley, a Springfield Republican who will likely become Speaker of the Missouri House next year. This is the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. Welcome back to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air. I'm Jason Rosenbaum. As House Majority Leader, State Representative Alex Riley of Springfield has the great power and great responsibility of deciding which bills get debated in his chamber. And this time next year, Riley will likely become one of the most powerful political figures in Missouri state government when he becomes the Speaker of the Missouri House. Before he gets to that point, though, Riley will need to get through a 2026 legislative session that could be defined by a tough budgetary situation and potential roadblocks in the Missouri Senate. And it's also unclear just how large the GOP House majority will be, given national polling showing a sharp downturn in fortune for Republicans. Riley joins us from Springfield to talk about his legislative philosophy and how he sees the rest of the year going for Missouri House Republicans. Leader Riley, welcome to the Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air.
Thank you so much for having me.
Before we talk about issues and politics, tell us a little bit about yourself. Who is Alex Riley, and how did he get involved in Missouri politics?
Yeah, I appreciate that. So I am an attorney here in Springfield. I do a lot of work with businesses, business owners, people who want to start businesses, and really help them navigate every step of the legal process. More importantly than that, though, my favorite hat that I wear is I'm a dad. I've got 4 little kids. I've got a 6-year-old boy, a 5-year-old girl, a 3-year-old boy, and then a new-ish 4-month-old little girl.
I was gonna make some sort of joke about how having 4 kids is probably like wrangling legislative votes, but does that fact that you have lots and lots of kids make you well suited to be Speaker of the House?
You know, it's kind of funny because there is some overlap in the skill set. The way some legislators can react sometimes can look a little bit like toddlers. So I do think there is some overlap there.
I don't think you had any competition when you were like seeking out the speakership. You kind of were elevated by acclamation. Is that correct, or was this like a bruising process to get here?
So you are correct. At one point in time, there was another person who was looking at it. He ended up deciding to do something different. So for me, a lot of it, I think, was because I spent a lot of time building relationships with every faction within the House Republican caucus. And as you know, we have a lot. It's not really true that we just have a Republican supermajority where everyone thinks the same and votes the same way. We really have more like 4 or 5 or 6 different factions that see the world very differently. And for me, what I wanted to do was focus on bringing those factions together as much as I can around the shared policy goals that we have. Because even as different as the factions in the House are, and as different as the different parts of the state are geographically, we all have things in common. And I wanted to focus on those things that we have in common, working towards getting those policies done. And that was something that the caucus appreciated. And I think the results sort of speak for themselves at this point.
So let's talk about the current legislative session. We talked about Missouri Governor Mike Kehoe's income tax plan in the prior segment. That proposal is being shepherded by House Speaker John Patterson. My understanding is there was a new version of this ballot proposal that was recently put forward that's different from the one that a lot of people saw after the State of the State. Do you think that the end result will ultimately mirror what Kehoe talked about in his speech, which means a 5-year phase out, triggers that will stop the phase out if revenue declines, and perhaps some carve outs to expanding the sales tax, meaning that it wouldn't be applied to things like agriculture, healthcare, or real estate?
I do. In broad strokes, I do think that's where we end up. As far as the exact legislation that's been filed, I do think it's going to look different by the time it makes it all the way through the process. The legislative process is supposed to be hard. It's supposed to have lots of diverse viewpoints that are represented and have those views taken into account as much as they can. So I think there's going to be changes to those bills as they go through committee and as they go onto the floor of the House and ultimately work their way through the Senate too. So I think broadly speaking, it's going to end up something like what the governor has talked about in his State of the State address. But I do think the exact language will look different than what's been filed so far.
We actually asked the governor about what sort of thing Missouri has that would generate a lot of revenue if the income tax went away. He said tourism. And look, I like going to Branson as much as everybody else. I like Lake of the Ozarks too. Would you concede, though, that those type of destinations are not nearly as big of draws as places like Florida or Nevada or even Tennessee? Missouri just may not have that thing that could attract a lot of revenue like those other states.
I would agree to a point that we don't have the same tourism draws as Florida and California is not a no income tax state, but we certainly don't have the same tourism draws as other parts of the country. At the same time, one of the things that we do have that's different, that makes us strong and that I think makes this work, is we have a very diverse economy. We aren't as dependent on one particular thing. We have a manufacturing base. We have a strong services sector. We have a strong agriculture sector. We have a lot of things that help make our economy diverse and strong. And I think that will help too.
One of the reasons why expectations for the 2026 session are frankly kind of low is that Senate Democrats may try to slow the process down even on non-controversial measures. We saw that this week when they were filibustering gubernatorial nominees. Will that make it more difficult to pass things like the income tax plan we've talked about, or even things that are not overtly controversial but may be used as leverage because Democrats in the Senate are still very upset that debate was cut off so much, both in the regular and special sessions last year?
Yeah, I do think that is likely. One thing I would note from my perspective, policy debates are absolutely fair game. Republicans and Democrats, and as we've talked about, different factions within the Republican parties and the Democrat Party see the world very differently when it comes to policy and what they think is the best thing for the state and for their constituents. What I hope we don't see, and I think will be nothing but damaging for the state, is if you see people holding up non-controversial, overwhelmingly bipartisan things for their own political advantage. That's what concerns me the most. And I hope once we get through these first few weeks of session, or maybe even the first couple of months of session, as we're trying to work through the bumps and navigate some of those past hurt feelings, which I understand and respect, I would just want to make sure that there is a group that is willing to govern and do the things that we need to do to make our state grow and thrive. And when we have bipartisan things, especially things that we just all agree, hey, we need to do this. I'll say, we're working on bills right now in the House on sex trafficking, which is a big problem across the state of Missouri, certainly along the I-44 corridor, which attaches, my hometown of Springfield to yours there in St. Louis, that we can set aside some of the partisan bickering to work together on those types of things to help the people in our state.
So there is a political role to being the speaker designee. You basically are responsible for making sure the House Republicans have a good election night this November. And I'm going to criticize, I guess, like journalist prognosticators in Missouri, including myself. There's been predictions for years that the GOP would lose their supermajority in the House, only for Democratic gains to be minimal or non-existent. But if it is a very bad election year for Republicans nationally, and at this point in time, which is, I guess, January 23rd, 2026, the polls are not looking great for Republicans nationally. Is it possible this is a year where your caucus does not come out election night unscathed and you might lose a few seats just because the national environment swings back toward the Democrats?
I think every single year, to your point, we hear prognostications that the Republicans are going to lose seats, and sometimes large numbers of seats in the House of Representatives and even in the Senate too, including even last year when, as late as September and October, folks, including some in the minority party leadership, were talking that they thought that we as Republicans were going to lose 5+ seats. And then we ended up coming into the session with the exact same number of representatives as we did in the prior General Assembly. So I think at this point, it's really too early to say which way the cycle is going to go. I will say from my perspective, we have a very strong bench of incoming candidates. We have really strong candidates in a lot of the swing districts, whether it's the St. Louis suburban area, the Kansas City suburban area, or here in Springfield. We have some really strong candidates. Our fundraising has been stronger than it's been for a very long time. So without question, there are going to be things that happen at the national level that we can't control and that will absolutely have an impact on elections here in Missouri. But as far as the things that we can control with our candidate recruitment, with our fundraising, we are far and above where we have been in the past at this point in an election cycle. So I think going in, we are well positioned.
The big things on the ballot are going to be these ballot initiatives that Republicans have put forward. You have this proposal that would repeal much of an abortion rights initiative that voters approved in 2024. You have another measure that would restrict constitutional amendments that are put forward to the voters through the initiative petition process. You may have this income tax plan that's put up for a vote. You may have the congressional map that you all passed in the special session go up for a referendum. I got to go back to the national environment again, though, because you may run the best campaigns for all those things I just mentioned, but they could all be brought down if Democratic turnout is high because it's a midterm election under a Republican president. Is that a fair thing to assume, that it's not going to be easy to pass any of these things if it is not a great year overall for Republicans nationally?
Absolutely. I don't disagree with that assessment at all. I think that right now, and understandably so, you do see a high level of Democrat enthusiasm for showing up at the polls and voting. So, yes, I think that's true. Without some really compelling thing at the top of the ballot that will drive out Republican turnout, that is going to be a tricky dynamic for us that we're going to have to navigate. And we've done that before. We've had plenty of other tricky election cycles, and like we've talked about, how we've overperformed in those. But yes, you are correct. That is a tricky dynamic for us.
State Representative Alex Riley serves as Missouri's House Majority Leader and is slated to become Speaker of the Missouri House next year. Representative Riley, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me.
The Politically Speaking Hour on St. Louis on the Air is produced by Jason Rosenbaum, Alex Hoyer, Emily Woodbury, Danny Wysentowski, Maya Norfleet, and Elaine Cha. Audio engineering and sound design by Aaron Dorr. The politics editor is Fred Ehrlich.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations. And leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thanks.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.